The black car skidded to a stop on the gravel path, tires spraying wet stones in every direction. Jonathan Ashford threw the door open before the driver could even reach for it, stepping out into the pouring rain without an umbrella, without his coat buttoned, without a single thought for the fact that he was one of the richest men in the country. He was running through a cemetery, past rows of gray headstones blurred by rain, his $900 shoes sinking into wet grass, because 30 seconds ago his phone had buzzed with a single text from the cemetery caretaker. "Someone's at Emily's grave. You should come." His heart pounded harder than it had in a decade. Nobody visited Emily's grave. Nobody except him. He rounded the last row of headstones and stopped dead. A little girl no older than 8 knelt in front of his daughter's grave, carefully arranging a small bundle of wildflowers against the marble. Her clothes were thin for the weather, soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. She didn't flinch at the sound of his footsteps. She didn't even look surprised. She simply turned, looked up at him with calm brown eyes, and said the words that would shatter the walls he'd spent 10 years building around his heart. "She told me you'd come today." Jonathan Ashford, a man who negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking, could not speak. If you've ever had a moment where a stranger said something that made the whole world stop turning for a second, stay with this story, because it only gets more unbelievable from here. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button now, because you will not want to miss where this one goes. Rain dripped from Jonathan's chin. He stared at the child, waiting for her to laugh, to say she was joking, to say anything that made sense. She did none of that. She simply turned back to the flowers, patting the dirt gently around the stems as if tucking in a sleeping child. "Who are you?" Jonathan finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Lily," the girl said simply, as though that explained everything. "How do you know my daughter's name? How do you know I'd be here?" Lily looked at the gravestone, then back at him. "Emily," she said softly, "beloved daughter." She traced the letters in the air without touching the stone. "She used to come find me. Well, not her, but her kindness did." Jonathan crouched down, ignoring the mud soaking into his slacks. Up close, he could see the girl was thinner than she should be, her cheeks hollowed in a way that made something twist in his stomach. "I don't understand," he said. "Please, explain it to me." But Lily only shook her head, gathering the last of her flowers into a neat pile. "Sometimes people leave messages in places no one else thinks to look," she said. Then she stood, brushed the wet grass from her knees, and began walking away between the headstones. "Wait," Jonathan called out, rising too fast, his knees protesting. "Wait, please, where do you live? Who's your family?" She paused at the edge of the path, turned halfway back to him, rain running down her small face. "My grandma," she said. "She's sick, but that's not why I'm here." And then she was gone, disappearing between the trees at the cemetery's edge as quickly and quietly as she'd arrived. Jonathan stood frozen in the rain for a long moment, his mind refusing to process what had just happened. Then his eyes drifted back down to the flowers Lily had left. Something pale peeked out from beneath the petals. A corner of paper, folded small, tucked into the dirt like a secret. He knelt again and pulled it free. It was a letter, old, the edges soft and worn, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times before finally being buried here. And on the front, in handwriting that stopped his heart cold, were 4 words. "For my dad someday." It was Emily's handwriting. His daughter had been dead for 10 years. Jonathan's hands shook so violently he nearly tore the paper trying to open it. He didn't care about the rain soaking through the pages, didn't care that his driver was standing 20 feet away under an umbrella, watching his employer sink to his knees in the mud like a broken man. All Jonathan cared about was the impossible fact in his hands, his daughter's voice, reaching him across a decade of silence. Before we go further into this letter and what it revealed, if you're the kind of person who believes messages can outlive the people who write them, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. This story is about to take a turn nobody sees coming. 10 years earlier, Jonathan Ashford had been a different man, not kinder, not softer, but present. He remembered Emily's laugh, high and bright, echoing through the halls of a house that used to feel like a home instead of a museum of empty rooms. She'd been 16 when the accident happened. A rain-slicked road, a truck that skidded through a red light, and in an instant everything Jonathan had ever built meant nothing. He didn't cry at the funeral. He remembered that clearly, how the cameras had caught him standing stiff and silent while his wife wept beside him, how the tabloids had called him cold, unfeeling, a businessman who couldn't even grieve his own child. What none of them knew was that Jonathan had gone home that night and sat alone in Emily's room until sunrise, unable to make a single sound, because some pain is too large for tears. His marriage hadn't survived the year that followed. His wife left, unable to bear a house that had become a shrine to sorrow, and Jonathan had thrown himself into his work with a ferocity that terrified even his most ruthless executives. He built hotels. He acquired failing companies and stripped them for parts. He signed deals that made him richer and lonelier in the same breath, because grief needed somewhere to go, and ambition was the only outlet he had left. Every year on the anniversary of Emily's death, he visited her grave alone. He brought white lilies because she'd loved them as a little girl, though he couldn't remember when she'd stopped loving anything he knew about her. That was the cruelest part of losing a child as a teenager. You buried the person they were becoming, not the person you fully knew. And every year for 10 years, he'd knelt at that same gravestone and whispered the same words. "I'd trade every dollar I own just to hear you laugh one more time." This year, for the first time, someone else had been listening. Jonathan sat in the back of his car as it idled outside the cemetery gates, the letter trembling in his hands, rain drumming on the roof like a held breath. He unfolded the pages slowly, carefully, as if the paper itself might dissolve if he moved too fast. "Dad, if you're reading this, it means someone finally found their way to my grave and found their way to you too. I always knew you would come every year. I used to imagine it, actually. You in your expensive coat, standing there with flowers, probably still working through some deal in your head even while you talked to me. I'm not angry about that. I understood you better than you think. There's something I never told you, and I think it's time you knew. Every Saturday for 2 years, I volunteered at St. Agnes Children's Hospital. I told you I was at study group. I'm sorry for lying, but I knew you'd worry, or worse, you'd try to write a check and make it your project instead of mine. I needed this to be mine. I read to kids who were too sick to go to school. I held hands with kids who were scared of needles. I made a little box, I called it the kindness box, and I'd leave notes inside for the nurses to pass along to families who needed something to hold onto, just small things. You are not alone today. Someone out there is thinking of you. I never signed my name. It wasn't about me. Dad, if you're reading this, it means you're finally listening with your heart, not just your calendars and your calculators. I don't need you to build me a monument. I need you to find the people I couldn't finish helping. There's still so much left to do. Please don't let it end with me. I love you. I always did, even in the years when neither of us said it out loud. Emily. Jonathan pressed the letter to his chest and wept, the first tears he had allowed himself in 10 years, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body in the back of a car worth more than most people's houses. His driver said nothing, only pulled the divider closed to give him privacy, understanding without needing to be told that something enormous had just cracked open. For 10 years, Jonathan had believed he knew everything about who his daughter was. He'd been wrong. Emily hadn't just been a girl who loved lilies and laughed easily. She had been someone who snuck away every Saturday to sit with dying children. Someone who left anonymous kindness in a cardboard box because she didn't need credit, only impact. Someone who had somehow, impossibly, arranged for a message to reach him a decade after her death. He thought of the little girl in the rain. She told me you'd come today. How? How could an 8-year-old possibly know about a letter buried for 10 years, about a father's yearly pilgrimage, about a daughter's secret life at a children's hospital? He needed to find her. This is the part of the story where things start moving fast, so if you haven't already, tap that like button. It genuinely helps more people discover stories like this one. Now let's find out who Lily really is. It took 3 days and more money than most people make in a year to track her down. Jonathan hired a private investigator, gave him nothing but a first name, an age, a general location near the cemetery, and a description of a thin girl with dark hair and old, tired eyes. 2 days later, the investigator called with an address in Millbrook Heights, a neighborhood Jonathan had driven past 100 times without ever really seeing it. Cracked sidewalks, boarded windows, a corner store with bars on its door. Jonathan went alone. No driver, no assistant, no bodyguards. He parked 2 blocks away and walked, feeling out of place in his tailored coat among buildings that seemed to be holding themselves up out of sheer stubbornness. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building, the stairwell smelling faintly of mildew. He knocked, and after a long pause the door opened just a crack, held by a chain. An older woman peered out at him, her face lined with exhaustion, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice thin but sharp with suspicion. "My name is Jonathan Ashford," he said. "I'm looking for a girl named Lily. I believe she visited my daughter's grave a few days ago." The woman's eyes widened, then narrowed again. "Ashford," she repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the name. "You're the businessman, the one from the papers." "Yes." "Lily's at school," the woman said. "She'll be back in an hour. You can wait or you can come in, but I want to know why a man like you is standing at my door." Jonathan stepped inside a small, spotless apartment that held almost nothing, a worn couch, a single lamp, a small table with 2 chairs. Poverty, he realized, didn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looked like careful, quiet survival. The woman introduced herself as Margaret. She lowered herself into a chair slowly, wincing, and gestured for Jonathan to sit across from her. "I have congestive heart failure," she said bluntly, before he could ask. "Lily takes care of me more than I take care of her most days, though she'd never admit that's what she's doing. She thinks she's just helping around the house." Jonathan's throat tightened. "How do you know my daughter?" Margaret's expression softened, and for the first time, something like recognition passed over her face. "I worked at St. Agnes Children's Hospital for 11 years, she said. "Nursing assistant. I met your daughter when she started coming on Saturdays. Sweetest girl I ever knew. Never wanted anyone to know her name, she just called herself a friend." Jonathan's hands curled into fists in his lap, not from anger, but from the overwhelming weight of finally hearing his daughter described by someone who had known a version of her he'd never met. "There was a box," Margaret continued, "a cardboard box decorated with stickers sitting on the nurse's station. Emily filled it with little notes. After she passed," Margaret paused, glancing at Jonathan carefully. After the accident, we didn't know what to do with the box. It felt wrong to throw it away, so I kept it. Kept adding to it myself over the years whenever I had something kind to say and no one to say it to. And Lily. Lily was born premature, Margaret said. Spent 3 months in that hospital as a baby, hooked up to more machines than I could count. Her mother wasn't in a place to raise her. Margaret's voice caught slightly, and she didn't elaborate further. I ended up keeping her, raising her myself. She grew up practically living in that hospital, playing in the hallways while I worked. When she was old enough to read, she found the kindness box in a storage closet after I retired and brought it home. She's read every single note in there. She started leaving flowers for whoever the mystery friend was. She didn't know it was your daughter, not at first. Not until last year, when I finally told her the whole story, showed her Emily's photo from an old hospital newsletter. Jonathan sat in stunned silence. The pieces were arranging themselves into a picture too enormous to fully hold. She started visiting the grave herself, he asked. Every week, Margaret confirmed. Sometimes just to sit. She says Emily's grave feels less lonely than some of the others. Lily visits a lot of graves, actually. Old ones, forgotten ones. She says everyone deserves to be remembered by somebody. Before Jonathan could respond, the apartment door opened, and Lily stepped inside, backpack slung over one shoulder, stopping short at the sight of him sitting in her living room. "You found me," she said, not with alarm but with something closer to quiet satisfaction. "I need to understand," Jonathan said, standing. "The letter. How did you know I'd come that day of all days?" Lily set her backpack down carefully. "Grandma told me your daughter's death date," she said. "I've been going every year around that time just in case. This year, I found the letter buried a little deeper than I expected, like it had been there a long time, waiting. I didn't read it. It wasn't mine to read. I just made sure it was where you'd find it." "You put it there?" Lily shook her head. "No, I think Emily did that herself a long time ago. Grandma said Emily used to talk about writing you a letter for someday when you were ready. I think she buried it near her own grave before she died, maybe hoping someone would help it find its way to you eventually. I just uncovered it, moved the dirt, that's all." Jonathan sank back down into the chair, overwhelmed. His daughter had prepared this moment years in advance, entrusting fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, to deliver her final words to him exactly when he needed them most. If this story is giving you chills the way it's giving me chills writing it, let us know in the comments. We're only halfway through, and the hardest part is still ahead. Over the following weeks, Jonathan found himself returning to Millbrook Heights again and again, at first under the pretense of understanding the mystery, and later simply because he wanted to. He brought groceries the first time, which Margaret firmly refused until he framed it as a trade for her stories about Emily. He brought a portable oxygen concentrator the second time, better than the one she'd been struggling with, and Margaret's pride finally gave way to quiet gratitude. He watched Lily in ways that unsettled him with how familiar they felt. She organized her homework with the same meticulous focus Emily used to bring to her art projects. She hummed under her breath while she worked, an unconscious habit Jonathan hadn't heard in a decade but recognized instantly. She wasn't Emily. He knew that. But something in her spirit rhymed with his daughter's in a way that made his chest ache every time he visited. "You keep coming back," Margaret observed one evening, as Lily did homework at the kitchen table nearby. "Why?" Jonathan considered the question honestly. "Because for 10 years I thought grief was something you carried alone in silence until it eventually stopped hurting so much. I've learned it doesn't stop, but apparently it can turn into something else if you let it." Meanwhile, back at Ashford Global Holdings, Jonathan's absence from the office was beginning to draw attention. His right hand, an executive named Richard Voss, cornered him after a board meeting one afternoon, visibly agitated. "You've missed 2 acquisition calls this week," Richard said, keeping his voice low but sharp. "The Meridian deal is worth $400 million, and you're spending your afternoons in some slum with a sick old woman and her charity case." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone, Richard." "I'm watching the company," Richard shot back. "Shareholders don't care about your personal redemption arc, Jonathan. They care about returns." "Maybe I care about something else now." Richard studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, calculation, concern, or perhaps genuine confusion at watching a man he'd known for 15 years become someone he no longer recognized. "This isn't like you," he finally said. "No," Jonathan agreed quietly. "It isn't. Maybe that's the point." That night, alone in his enormous, echoing house, Jonathan sat with Emily's letter spread open on the table before him, reading it again for perhaps the 100th time. "Find the people I couldn't finish helping. There's still so much left to do." He thought of the kindness box, still sitting somewhere in Margaret's closet, filled with a decade of small handwritten mercies. He thought of Lily visiting forgotten graves because she believed everyone deserved to be remembered. He thought of the ruthless deals he'd signed over the past 10 years, the companies gutted, the families uprooted, all in the name of growth that had never actually made him feel less alone. For the first time since the funeral, Jonathan began to cry, not from grief this time, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. We're getting close to the moment everything changes, and if you want more stories exactly like this one, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. Now, back to Jonathan. The final piece of the puzzle arrived on a Sunday afternoon, when Margaret, her breathing labored but her voice steady, finally told Jonathan the full story she'd been holding back. "There's something else," she said, as Lily played outside with neighborhood children, her laughter drifting faintly through the open window. "Something I wasn't sure I should tell you." Jonathan waited, bracing himself. "Lily's mother," Margaret said slowly, "was a teenager herself when she had her. 16 years old, scared, alone. She came to St. Agnes because she had nowhere else to go. Your daughter was the one who sat with her the night Lily was born early, 3 months premature, barely bigger than my hand. Emily held that scared 16-year-old girl's hand through the whole delivery because nobody else would. Lily's mother couldn't keep her. She was a child herself, without support, without a home. She asked me to take her, and I did, because I'd already grown to love that tiny baby girl through all those months in the NICU." Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. Emily was there when Lily was born. Margaret nodded, tears gathering in her tired eyes. "Your daughter held Lily first before I did, before her own mother even, because the poor girl was in no state. Emily used to sneak into the NICU on her Saturdays just to check on her, this little girl nobody else was checking on. She used to say," Margaret's voice broke, "she used to say, everybody deserves someone in their corner." I think that's exactly what Lily grew up believing, without ever fully understanding where the idea came from. Jonathan sat in stunned silence, tears streaming freely down his face. Lily wasn't connected to Emily by blood, by accident, or by strange coincidence. She was connected by something far more meaningful, by a single act of compassion, offered by a scared, secretive 16-year-old girl who chose to sit beside a stranger when no one else would. Emily's kindness hadn't ended when her life did. It had simply kept moving, quietly, patiently, until it eventually returned to the very father who never knew about it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Jonathan asked, his voice raw. Because I didn't know if you'd believe it, Margaret admitted, or if you'd try to turn it into something it isn't. Lily isn't a project, Mr. Ashford. She isn't a symbol. She's a little girl who deserves better than being someone's redemption story. Jonathan wiped his face and nodded slowly. You're right, I understand. But even as he said it, he knew something had to change, not as an act of charity, but as an act of honoring the daughter he was only now beginning to fully know. This is the moment we've been building toward the whole video, and honestly, it gets me every time. If you're still with us, comment your favorite line from the story so far. I read every single one. 3 weeks later, Jonathan stood before a room full of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones angled toward him like a forest of black flowers. He'd called the press conference himself, refusing Richard Voss's suggestion to have the communications team draft a statement. 10 years ago, Jonathan began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, I lost my daughter, Emily. For a long time, I believed the best way to honor her memory was to keep building more companies, more wealth, more legacy in my own name. I was wrong. He told them about the letter. He told them, in broad strokes, about the little girl at the cemetery, about the kindness box, about a 16-year-old who had quietly held a stranger's hand through the hardest night of her young life without ever asking for recognition. Today, I'm announcing the Emily Ashford Foundation, Jonathan continued, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. We will be funding a new children's wing at St. Agnes Hospital, fully staffed and equipped at no cost to families. We are establishing a scholarship program for young caregivers, children who take on adult responsibilities within their own families. The way my daughter once quietly cared for others without asking anything in return. And we are launching housing support initiatives for families like the one who taught me, far too late, what my daughter was truly made of. A reporter called out from the crowd, Mr. Ashford, why now? Why after 10 years of silence? Jonathan smiled, a real smile, the kind that hadn't touched his face in over a decade. Because my daughter has been teaching me, he said, even after she was gone. It just took me 10 years to finally start listening. The announcement made headlines within hours. Business analysts speculated about tax strategies and reputation management, entirely missing the point, as Jonathan had expected they would. But somewhere in Millbrook Heights, an old woman with an oxygen tube read the news on a second-hand tablet and smiled through tears, while a little girl who didn't yet understand the scale of what had just happened simply asked if this meant her grandmother could finally see a proper cardiologist. It did. It meant exactly that and so much more. We're almost at the ending now, and I promise it's worth every second. If this story has moved you even a little, hit like right now before we go any further. It truly makes a difference for this channel. 6 months later, autumn returned, the same season it had been when Jonathan first stumbled through the rain toward his daughter's grave. But everything about that walk felt different now. The sky was clear this time, pale golden light filtering through half-turned leaves, and Jonathan wasn't alone. Beside him walked Lily, now enrolled in a private school on a scholarship funded quietly through the foundation, her uniform crisp, her posture proud in a way that hadn't been there before. Margaret followed slowly behind, breathing easier than she had in years thanks to a new medication regimen and a heart specialist who finally had the resources to actually help her. And behind them, streaming through the cemetery gates in a gentle, colorful procession, came dozens of children from St. Agnes Children's Hospital, some in wheelchairs, some walking carefully with parents or nurses beside them, every single one of them carrying a single flower. The cemetery caretaker, a quiet man who had worked among the dead for 23 years, stood near the gate and watched with something like wonder on his weathered face. He had buried grief in this ground more times than he could count. He had never once seen it walk back out looking like this, like celebration instead of sorrow. Jonathan knelt before Emily's gravestone, the same white lilies in his hands that he'd brought every year for a decade. But this time, as he set them down, Lily knelt beside him, adding her own small bundle of wildflowers to the growing pile. "Thank you," Lily said softly, looking at the gravestone rather than at Jonathan, "for everything you did without even knowing you were doing it." Jonathan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he replied, "for finding your way to me. I don't think I would have found my way back on my own." One by one, the children from St. Agnes approached the grave, laying their flowers gently until the gray marble was completely transformed, buried beneath a riot of color, yellows and purples and soft pinks, petals overlapping petals until there was no gray left to see at all. Some of the children were too young to understand exactly what they were honoring. They only knew that a kind man had built them a beautiful new hospital wing. That scary needle days now came with someone reading stories beside them. That somewhere, somehow, a girl their age had loved them all first, long before any of them had even been born. Jonathan stood at the edge of the grave, watching the flowers pile higher, watching Lily laugh with the other children despite the solemnity of the setting, watching Margaret finally breathe without struggle in the crisp autumn air. He thought of all the years he'd spent building empires that made him richer and emptier in equal measure. He thought of the daughter he'd only truly come to know after her death, through the echo of kindness she'd left rippling outward into a world she'd never got to see fully grown. He knelt one final time, placing his palm flat against the cool marble, feeling the letters of her name beneath his fingers. "You never really left me," he whispered, so quietly that only the wind could carry the words away. "You just showed me another way to find you." The camera of memory pulled back in his mind, the way it always did in moments too large to hold all at once. The grave buried in flowers, the children's laughter rising into the pale afternoon sky, Lily's small hand slipping into his own without either of them quite deciding to let it happen. Not from sadness anymore. From something that finally, after 10 long years, felt like gratitude. If this story touched you even a fraction as much as it touched me while telling it, please take 3 seconds right now to like this video. Drop a comment sharing what moment hit you hardest, and subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one. Stories like Jonathan and Emily's remind us that kindness doesn't end when a life does. It simply finds new hands to carry it forward. Thank you for watching until the very end. We'll see you in the next story.